Hello, class, and welcome. We finally get into our discussion of Aristotle's ethics, the Nicomachean ethics. Okay. Um, Thank you for the excitement. As some of you know, my class here at St. Vincent, I'm also giving some of these lectures in front of some individuals who used to be in my parish from Canada, the ones that are listening today, because it makes it a little easier if I'm trying to do these lectures and there are real live people that are present, and hopefully that'll make the discussion, or that will make my train of thought a little bit more superior. There's a lot that we could say considering historical circumstances of Aristotle's ethics. That's really not my aim for this class. And so hopefully you will take a look at some of that on your own. Just look it up on Google. What I would like to say, at least, is that I did mention in class that great genealogy of philosophers, that Socrates was this individual who, of course, in Athens, began to walk around questioning numerous individuals about what we would consider philosophical subjects. Exactly why he did that is another story. He really felt compelled by what he called his daimon, a spirit within him. It's really difficult to translate the word daimon into demon in English, because daimon in Greek doesn't have the connotations of demon. Demon, when we think of the word demon in English, we immediately think of something wicked. In Greek, a daimon was simply, could be a guiding spirit, okay? But this spirit, and it's much disputed exactly the nature of this spirit that Socrates had, began to prompt him to ask philosophical questions of mostly the leaders in Athens. And there's much more to the story than this, but I'm not going to get into it right now. And I'm going to refer back to that, especially when we start talking about the nature of the good. But just suffice it to say that this is around, ballpark 550-ish BC, I want to say, maybe 600. I would have to check on that. But Socrates ended up having a little cadre of followers, mostly younger men who were quite fascinated and impressed by Socrates' intelligence, and honestly by the fact that Socrates was a bit of a troublemaker. He made lots of people quite upset. As a matter of fact, it was so upset that they ended up executing him for it. So a little bit upset, I would call that kind of upset, but he did have a group of followers in Athens, and his star pupil was Plato. Plato ended up recording, Plato was, you could in a sense say, was like a secretary for Socrates. And Plato records dialogues, dialogues of people speaking one to another. The main character, I think, is always, or usually is always, Socrates. And so he's discussing different philosophical views with various persons of the day. Now, it is also disputed just exactly how much is Plato really recording what Socrates actually said, and how much is Plato just being creative, kind of putting some of his own views in the mouth of Socrates, the way that often, modern creative writers do. Okay, we're not sure where that line is. We're not sure, because we have no single sentence that Socrates himself actually wrote. That's rather interesting. Okay, But so Plato is Socrates' star student. And guess who Plato's star student was? Aristotle. Okay, so this is a little introduction to where this comes from. Now, the reason why it is called the Nicomachean Ethics is Aristotle's son was named Nicomachus. And he is the one who took, these are class notes. If you're taking notes as I'm speaking, which you should be, just imagine that, well, imagine for a moment that I'm brilliant, which might be difficult, more like Aristotle, and that you are also pretty brilliant. So you have a brilliant person speaking and a brilliant person taking notes, you know, and that equals a really incredible book, one of the greatest philosophical works that's ever been written. Okay, so that's where we get the book. I am, for those of you that are truly philosophers out there, you understand that I am definitely painting this with very broad strokes, and I'm leaving out a lot, but just trying to give an introduction to undergrads, to understand some of the basics of Western civilization, some of our basic answers that an intelligent person should be able to know where this comes from, because it is truly one of the greatest things that has ever been written. And there has been some may dispute that, but I would say that they would truly be unreasonable people, because there have been many in our philosophical tradition, and this is about for the past 2,500 years, that even if you do not agree with the principles in this book, would at least agree that it generated some of the most fascinating ideas that have ever been generated. That is really not disputed so much. So you might dislike Aristotle, but at least as an intelligent human being, you should have some respect for him. Does that make some sense? I mean, even someone like Nietzsche, who really more or less despised virtue ethics, would still respect Aristotle as a truly noble and creative thinker. So I think that these are important things for us to understand. Now, need some vitamins. If I were to cut and paste this book, I would definitely, if I got you to read one single book in this text, I would get you to read book 1 and then move on, okay? It is the most important book in the ethics. It lays out certain basic principles that we really do need to spend some time on, or at least to look at a little bit more closely. And of course, if you don't understand what Aristotle is doing in book 1, the rest of it doesn't make a lot of sense. But that really goes without saying for most intelligent works. You put most of your principles in the introduction, and then you spend the rest of your time developing those principles. So the single most important concept, probably in the whole book, or certainly one of them, without which you cannot understand Aristotle's ethics, is the good, the telos. Okay, this is, you must understand what this means. For those of you that are going to be taking exams with me, let me repeat that. You must understand what this means. What do we really mean when we say that something is good? What are we saying? I mean, this is philosophy, so we want to stop and try to think more deeply. And does that, if I say this cell phone is good, what does that mean? Does it just mean that I like it? Or does it mean something a little bit more deep than that? And there are many different senses in which we can say something is good. But the most important sense in which we need to understand that at least Aristotle used with this word good is he held to a kind of philosophy that we would call teleological. That's a mouthful, with the root word being telos, teleological. I'm sure you're intelligent enough to spell it yourself. But that is the kind of philosophy that holds that everything that exists is going somewhere, is aiming towards some kind of goal. Everything that exists in a certain way, and it exists in a certain way to fulfill a certain purpose. Now, we're talking about, these are very broad ideas, I understand, but I'll try to give you some examples in order to unpack this a bit. What is the telos, or the good, of an apple tree? I mean, if we thought about it, hopefully we'd say, well, the telos of an apple tree is to bear apples, and to bear good ones. It's not just to sit there wasting the soil. I mean, apple trees can be quite pretty, but in other words, if we were to have two apple trees side by side, and one of them is bearing apples, and one of them is not, we would immediately say, this apple tree is better than this one. And we would actually have some quite reasonable premises on which to base that. This one is fulfilling its purpose, its end, its goal, okay? And this one is not. Do you see that distinction? Now, you can apply this to almost anything. Well, I think Aristotle would say you could apply this to everything in some way, shape, or form. Someone like, or a question like, well, what is the good? Think of an activity of carpentry. The good of carpentry is to actually create or repair sound, mostly wooden or metal objects, mostly wooden, right, with carpentry. And to do it well, that a good carpenter, if you would ask the question, and this is what Socrates would do, would go around that city. Remember, this would be Aristotle's grandfather in the intellectual genealogy. Would go around asking questions like, well, what is a good carpenter? Well, a good carpenter is one whose creations don't break, and they're quite useful. And we could very easily, and we do this all the time, or good mechanic for us. Do we not compare good mechanics with bad ones? Absolutely. Okay. This mechanic does not seem to fix things very well and costs me a lot of money. Okay. So this other mechanic is better. Think of better as related to the good, right? It's related to good. Pointing to the wrong thing. So one of them is fulfilling his or her purpose, and the other one is not. So Socrates would ask questions like, okay, well, what is a good carpenter? What is a good strategist? Certainly a very, very important job in a city-state like Athens. And they needed those that could strategize well, because if you didn't know people that understood military craft, then your city could be taken over by another one. And Aristotle even uses the concept of horsemanship. Horsemanship was incredibly important. He asks, like, well, what is a good horseman? It's one who truly understands horses, one who's able to work with them, who's able to train them, particularly for battle. Because if you didn't have good horsemen, you could lose your city. Okay, so knowing the craft of horsemanship and knowing it well was an incredibly important thing. Okay, that's one of the reasons why Aristotle brings up that example. So Aristotle would ask these questions, or Socrates would go around Athens asking these questions. What's a good horseman? What's a good general? What's a good carpenter? And then, and this was kind of the sticking point, or this is the hinge where everything changed. He started to ask, well, what is a good person? Oh, now we've got some problems. Okay. What Socrates found is that everyone began to stutter, so to speak, whenever he asked that question. Well, somebody who's, you see how that's a little bit harder of a question. It's not impossible to answer, but harder. This is why Aristotle wrote this book. Okay, that is kind of part of the inspiration. Aristotle wants to get at what he considers a practical guide. He considers this a practical guide, not a theoretical guide. He says that. He says that quite clearly. Okay. What is a good person? What does it mean? And Socrates was very flabbergasted when he began to ask these questions of, well, okay, isn't this a fine thing? And I'm kind of pretending to be Socrates. You can answer, what is a good carpenter? You can answer, what is a good horseman? You can answer even, what is a good housekeeper? Someone who keeps the finances of the home, but you cannot tell me what a good person is. Which of these questions is the most important? And yet you cannot give me an answer? Is it not a more important question to answer, what is a good human life? What is that? Isn't that a far more important question than what is a good carpenter? And yet you sit before me and you stutter and you cannot answer. This upset Socrates. This should upset us. Now, you might immediately go to the next question. Well, Father Basil, what is the answer? I don't know. I don't have a clue. Okay. I'm trying. This is why we do philosophy. Okay. There are some principles, of course, there are some principles to answering that question. And that's what we're getting into with our class, with ethics. Okay. We saw last week with that graph, and this is what was the purpose of me comparing things like utilitarian ethics, postmodern, maybe Nietzschean ethics, social contract ethics, Kantian or deontological ethics, that those different ways of answering the question, what is a good person, or what should we do? We find, and if you think about this, we find that we exist in this world. This is something, I didn't choose that. I didn't pick that. There's actually a fellow in India that this is I'm sure you can Google this. You could probably find it right away. I'm pretty sure the family is Indian. And I think both of his parents are lawyers. He has brought a lawsuit against his parents for bringing him into existence without his permission. Chew on that for a little bit, okay? This is the absolute height of ungratefulness and arrogance. That ethically, I think it might be quite interesting to talk about that in class, but we just find that we exist. Our existence is taken for granted. And so a logical question that we must answer, we really have no choice, is given that I exist, what direction shall I go in? Where shall I go? What shall I do? And by what principles is it better to go this way than it is that way? This is what ethics is. And what Aristotle is trying to give us is a set of principles of, no, going this way is better. And I'm giving you certainly not a manual of how to decide everything, because that's simply not possible. He's giving us some general principles about what a good life looks like and what principles govern it. Okay? Does that make some sense? Hopefully? Okay. Get a little bit of, is anything completely unclear at this point, just while I'm drinking my coffee? So far, so good. I know that this is broad, but I'll answer one of these questions because it's relevant. The review questions, I believe this is number 3. Oh, I have 2 different numberings for this, darn it. It's the question that says, what does he say about the limitations of study in ethics and politics? And I'll just tell you that there are several times in this book and in subsequent books that he calls this a rough sketch. He calls it an outline. He tells us that we cannot expect to get the same sort of answers that we would expect in what he might consider physics or mathematics. That it is unreasonable to expect the same rigor, the same precise answers. And he thinks, well, those people that try to do this they're unreasonable. They're stupid. He'll basically say that. I mean, Aristotle, in that sense, was somewhat of an elitist thinker. And that word has some bad connotations in our society. It really needn't always have bad connotations. It simply means that he did think some people were quite noble and intelligent, and some people were rather stupid and wicked. And that there's a difference between those two. Now, I don't know what you think. You may vehemently disagree with that, which is fine. I'm just trying to tell you what Aristotle thought, okay? A perfect example of this we could see in chapter 5 of book 1 is the common run of people, as we saw, betray their utter slavishness in their preference for a life suitable to cattle. Okay, that's pretty straightforward. He's basically saying there's really a lot of people that really live a lot more like animals than they live like men and women. And as kind of, I don't know, some of us would think that sounds rather snotty or arrogant. There's some good arguments for that. And I think we'll try to get into them. And again, you may disagree with some of these arguments, but my job is to try to present to you what Aristotle thinks. And this is what he thinks. Okay. So hopefully you understand this notion of the good. Hopefully you understand that the study of politics and ethics, Aristotle is very, very interested in politics. He spends a great deal of time There is another book called, strangely enough, The Politics. Okay. Aristotle loved these, very exciting titles. Okay. The Ethics, The Politics. Straightforward. Okay. He considers this as I mentioned, a practical guide. He does mention, and this is the translation, who is the appropriate student, particularly of politics, is a more mature, well, he would say a more mature man, because at the time, women were not invited into the group of citizenry, but of course we would say men and women. A young man is not equipped to be a student of politics, for he has no experience in the actions which life demands of him. And these actions form the basis and subject matter of this discussion. So he thinks politics is eminently practical, and he's actually saying, as brilliant of a thinker as Aristotle is, what he's saying is, you can't just be a bookworm egghead to study, particularly politics. Also ethics, I think, but more so politics, because politics is very complicated and it's rather raw, and you deal with many, many kinds of situations, and it is only experience that teaches you prudence. Prudence is a very, very vital virtue that we're going to learn about more. We call it one of the cardinal virtues, one of the hinges, because given the fact that, I don't know about you, I was not born with a user's manual. That would have been very useful, but I wasn't, okay? If you were, please give me a copy. I would really like to kind of see that. But because we don't have guides in every little situation, it stands to reason that we should develop a faculty that in every situation, and meaning doing things in the right way, regarding the right people to the right extent, in the right place, at the right time, and to the right intensity. Wow, what virtue governs that? What virtue helps me weigh the fact that that when I'm talking to one person about, say, what they should do with a relationship, and then I talk to another person, I'm like, look, you should break up with this person because they're crazy, or whatever advice I give them. But I talk to someone else and I give them completely different advice. Why? Because my prudence weighed all of these various circumstances. Okay, that's the virtue of prudence. And Aristotle valued it, of course, very highly. So that kind of gets us started into some of these concepts, particularly the concept of the good, okay, which is that we need to understand that in the same way, or at least analogously to something like the good of carpentry, or the good of an apple tree, the good of horsemanship, that the human person also has a good to which they aim. Very, very important statement. The good, the definition of the good is that towards which all things aim. Aristotle says that very clearly. I think he says it in the very first paragraph. But where do we aim? Where does the human person aim? And this is more or less the progression of Aristotle's argument. He tries to argue just what is the good in general, but specifically, now it's a given that we're talking about ethics, which is the behavior of the human person. Well, what is the good of a human person? Where does a human person aim? Very, very, very important question. Okay. That I'm hoping that, that I can answer well. Can we pause for a second? All right, I just wanted to try to clear up exactly where we're going in answering this very, very important question of what is the good of the human person specifically. What I've been trying to present to you is some introductory material, as well as to try to understand what the good is in general, as this understanding that everything in the universe really is purposed, has structure, has form, and activity follows on form. In other words, we really only understand what a thing is by really examining what it does. And that's a very Aristotelian way of looking at things. But in this question of what is the good of a human person, let's backtrack and say, okay, when you're asking what is the specific good of a thing or of an activity, that let me use some of the same examples that I've already used. If I were to say that it is the good of a carpenter to simply do his craft well, say that's how I define the good of a carpenter. At first, we might go, okay, well, that's not bad, but what's wrong with that definition? I don't know if anybody can. Mary, you want to take a stab at that? You listening? Mm-hmm. If I define a carpenter as someone who does his craft well, what problem can you see with that definition? There is a problem.
That carpenter is a person. So if all he was aiming to do in his life was to do his craft well, it wouldn't be very good for him.
Oh, you're trying to say, well, there's certainly more about his life, but I'm just saying the specific, well, I'll just have to tell you. The problem with that definition is that it could apply to any craftsman whatsoever. I mean, isn't it also, like I could say about the horseman or a mechanic, an electrician, a sculptor. That definition could apply to all of them. It's like, well, wait a minute. If you're saying the definition or the good of a carpenter is to do his craft well, wait a minute. How can that define a carpenter when it also defines all these other things? That's not a very good definition unless the definition gets to the very nature of the thing defined, okay? Now, if you narrow it down and start saying, well, no, the good of a carpenter is to produce excellent and well-made works of wood that are used in homes and in offices. So something to that effect. I'm just kind of thinking off the top of my head. Well, then you're getting specifically, right? You're getting specifically at the nature of the carpenter. So with that in mind, Aristotle, and I really want you to pay very close attention to chapter 7. That's the one that is entitled "The Good is Final and Self-Sufficient, and Happiness is Defined." Okay, for purposes of examination, for purposes of how important some of these concepts are, I want you to take a special look at that particular chapter. That's a freebie. I'm just going to throw that out, okay? That when we are defining something, we need to get at its proper function. Now, throwing out of what is the good of the human person, Aristotle says happiness. Happiness is where we're going. Happiness is our aim. Now we're going to have to backtrack and try to answer, well, what is that? What does that mean? Okay. Because it's a very important question, but I'll just give you the answer, and you should already know this. Of course you do, because we've already discussed it by the time you'll see this lecture. But he says on page 16 in this translation at the top, to call happiness the highest good is perhaps a little trite, and a clearer account of what it is still required. Perhaps this is best done by first ascertaining the proper function of man. Okay, based on what I just said, you should understand that. Okay, I'm trying to relate what I'm saying in my lecture to what you're reading on the page. Hopefully that helps you build a bridge. For just as the goodness and performance of a flute player, a sculptor, or any kind of expert, and generally of anyone who fulfills some function or performs any action, or thought to reside in his proper function, so the goodness and performance of man would seem to reside in whatever is his proper function. So that should make perfect sense to you. Now, like what is the specific thing that a human does that we could say, well, that's his or her good. That's what we're aiming at, okay? And I'll just go on because Aristotle says it better than I do. Let's see. What can this function possibly be? Simply living? It's like just be alive? Well, okay. He shares that even with plants. But we are now looking for something peculiar to man, to the human being. Accordingly, the life of nutrition and growth must be excluded. So what he's saying, and this is where I want you to take a look at this. This is what's called the hierarchy of being. Okay, that's why I put this on the board. That he's going through the functions of a living being. Okay, at the bottom, we just have creatures, so single cell creatures. They live, they feed, and if they don't, they die. Well, we do share that with even single cell creatures. But what he's saying is, well, our proper function can't be just this because we share that with all of the rest of them. So let's mark that off the list. You see what we're doing here? It's very logical, okay? In the same way that we marked off the list, like, well, it can't be the definition of a carpenter to just do his craft well, because he shares that with a bunch of other people. So let's cross that off the list. So this is what he's doing in this section, okay? Then he goes on. Next in line, there is the life of sense perception. I mean, I put movement and sense perception, really, they go together. You might even cross that off the list, honestly. But this man has in common with the horse, the ox, and every animal. So he's like, all right, well, so in other words, a life of sense pleasure. If you're saying the good of the human person is to just really experience lots of sense pleasure, Aristotle's like, no, that's absolutely not logical. Because we share that life with mere animals. So he's like, well, we can cross this off the list. We can cross this off. You know, we're not the only creatures in the world that move. We've got to mark that off. And we We can mark that off the list because we share this with animals. Okay, well, what's left? He says, there remains then an active life of the rational element. This is one of the more momentous passages in Western philosophy. You're looking at it right here, or these sections. Entire cultures have been based on some of these assumptions about the ethical life, okay? I just want to underline that for you, that we're definitely doing something quite important. You may disagree, but what you can't disagree with is the fact that entire cultures have been based on some of these assumptions. If you disagreed with that, you would just be uneducated, okay? You may disagree with whether it's right or wrong. That, well, we'll get to that further on in class, right? So, he skips on, the proper function of man, of the human person, then consists in an activity of the soul in conformity with a rational principle, or at least not without it. And let me go on, because this is too important. In speaking of the proper function of a given individual, we mean that it is the same in kind as the function of an individual who sets high standards for himself. In other words, he's saying the specific function of a human person is rational activity. That is what is specific to our species. Rational activity. Now, and there are some assumptions there, and you may immediately say, yes, Father Basil, but animals think as well. And yes, on a certain level, they think. But I think we could, if we are rational, we must stress on a certain level. Because you cannot prove to me, you really can't, that animals have a rational life. The capability, in other words, of having an interior world created of all the concepts that human beings are capable of creating. You cannot prove that whatsoever. You know, I've heard, I once had this young woman in class, and she said, well, how do you know that, you know, dolphins are not smarter than we are? And I'm like, well, by one, I said, I can't prove it to you, but what I can do is say, give me proof that a dolphin could be smarter than a human being. And there is no way that you can do that. You simply can't throw out assertions without proof. I can prove to you that a human person has an inner world because we fill libraries with books. We build cathedrals. We create cultures. There's some odd 6,000 or so different languages. We write poetry. We create music. I can prove to you that human beings have a rational world. Rationality. You cannot prove to me that an animal does. You can show me that animals can be very clever. You can show me that they even possess, at least at the higher levels, some emotions that are similar to human beings. Absolutely. But you cannot say that they have an inner world. You can't. Prove it to me. Show me a text written by a dolphin, okay, and then I'll change my lecture, okay? So what we have specific to us is this rational activity. So therefore, if we have to define the good as that towards which all things aim, if we're defining everything, well, what is its proper end? And then we're saying, well, no, when we define something, We need to truly isolate what is special to that one thing. What is special to the carpenter? It's working with wood. What's special to the horseman? It's working with horses, not other animals, but horses. What is special? What is unique to the human person? Rational activity. But Aristotle goes on in his immensely logical way of doing things. And I know, Chelsea, hopefully this will make you happier, because despite the fact that he's talking in very general principles, there is a very clear-cut logic to what he's doing. That not only are we supposed to aim at mere rational activity, but rational activity done well. Ah, ha. That is key. You will not understand this book without understanding what I just said. Okay, one of the most important sentences, one of the most important paragraphs in this book is on page 17. Okay, and then let me tell you what Aristotle says. The proper function of a harpist, for example, is the same. Let me repeat. The proper function of a harpist, for example, is the same as the function of a harpist who has set high standards for himself. The same applies to any and every group of individuals. The full attainment of excellence must be added to the mere function. In other words, the function of the harpist is to play the harp. The function of the harpist who has high standards for himself is to play it well. Okay, there we go. So Aristotle is introducing an incredibly important distinction here. It is not enough for a good life for human beings to simply be rational, because we can also take rational activity. Can we not maim and brutalize and be stupid with this rational activity? Absolutely we can. That's provable. Unless you're unreasonable, we can demonstrate that. So the distinction here is that happiness is a life in accordance with rational activity, and rational activity done well. Rational activity done well is what is called virtue. There's the payoff. There's the payoff. Bingo. Okay. Rational activity done well is virtue. And that will comprise the subject of the rest of this book. Do you see how it's absolutely vital for you to understand some of the assumptions that we have gone through before we simply start talking about what Aristotle is going, look, now I'm going to start talking about the virtues. What are virtues? Virtues are excellences of character. They would be the same. In other words, a prudent and temperate and just human being would be analogous to a harpist who knows precisely what she's doing and does it very well. I mean, and the ancients, particularly Plato and Aristotle, often compared a just man or woman, a spiritual man or woman, to a kind of musician, that their soul is in harmony. All of the elements of their soul, the different virtues, the different drives, the different emotions are harmonized. And it is in accordance with a rational principle, thought, but a rational principle used well. Because rational activity is a power. It's an ability, right? It's pure potential, as Aristotle would say. But that potential can go in many different directions, can it not? Okay. That rationality can be used for what Aristotle and what we, for the most part, would still call brutality or wickedness. Okay? Makes sense? So hopefully that does make some sense. We're at 4 o'clock. Now, where should we go from here? He does define, well, what is a good life? And he's examining various assumptions within his own culture. But there are assumptions that are very similar, really, to the assumptions that we have. And hopefully you understand, I am answering a number of the review questions as I lecture, but this is college, so I'm not simply going from number to number and supplying you with every answer, because that's more like high school work. I'm giving you a lecture that hopefully helps bind things together so that you can understand this a little better on your own. Hopefully that's what this lecture does for you. So what is a good life? In other words, when we're trying to live a life in accordance with a rational principle, done well, what are the candidates for what that might look like? And he goes through 3 major ones, that the goods that we aim at, and they would still be pretty similar for us: pleasure, wealth, honor. This has really always been the way. When you really look at what motivates us, and of course human motivation is incredibly complex, and so it's very much a generalization, that the life of, in other words, he's like, what makes us happy? And we're going to get to happiness in a moment as well, because that's, of course, incredibly important, as the answer to the question, what are we aiming at? Aristotle's answer to that question is happiness. But what he means by that is complex and it's nuanced. And so that's what we're trying to develop. What makes us happy? Here's some candidates, right? That's kind of the bottom line, okay? And Aristotle goes through discussing a few of these. And immediately, and hopefully you understand some of his assumptions, but we're not going to get too much into that because I think you can read that for yourself. He immediately is like, no, a good life it can't just be that. And why? It can't just be that because if you lived a life where pleasure, meaning the definition of pleasure, meaning really only the goods of the body, the goods of your senses, sight, touch, etc., sex, food, those basic things. If it's true that human beings are different than animals, we can't just chase after pleasure, because then we would be like animals. Pursuing the good of the body, and he's not saying that it's bad to pursue the good of the body. Who doesn't like to experience pleasure in some way, shape, or form? Of course we do. It's part of our nature. What Aristotle's saying is, yeah, but is that the highest goal? Is it the best? Is it really what we're after? And he's like, no, because if that were true, then we would be mere animals, especially with sense, mere animals. That is why he wrote, there's usually a method to my madness. Remember, I read that quote at the beginning that most men and women live lives suitable to cattle. So we get Aristotle's opinion, and you may disagree with that statement, but what he's saying is that most people, in fact, live on that level. Live on this level, which is the same as this level, sense, pleasure, over here. Okay, that most people do. And that there's much, much more. There's much more to what it means to live a happy life. That is not going to make you happy. Okay, now these happiness is really what we need to talk about for the rest of the time. Happiness. These are two different words for happiness in Greek. We're going to get eudaimonia and makarios. Okay, we'll get to that in just a moment. But let me move so that you can actually see it. But happiness, that's our goal, that's our aim, that's where the human person is headed. And there are some assumptions there that hopefully we'll tease out in a moment. Wealth, he's like, well, wealth cannot be the ultimate good because wealth goes into is merely a tool. And it's hard to acquire, and it's hard to hold on to. And one of the definitions that he has for happiness, or that happiness must fulfill two requirements. It must, I'll put them up here. It must be final, and it must be self-sufficient. I'm kind of bleeding over. I know my penmanship's not good. Happiness has to be final and it has to be self-sufficient. And if you're saying the good life is ultimately to get wealth, well, first of all, it's just a tool. It's a thing, and it's not something that exists in itself. It's something that can be lost. It's something that can be discarded. And why would we want to say that the highest good that we can attain is one that can be so easily lost? Right? That seems, it's like if that's your view of happiness, you're probably not going to be very happy, okay? Because if you're relying on something as ephemeral, as fleeting as wealth, it just simply makes no sense. One of the requirements for happiness is what we would say is it should be something that in a sense we have within us. It belongs truly to us. That's one of the explanations of what it means to be self-sufficient. Not the only one, but we could kind of throw it in there. Honor, and this honor is tricky. Is honor truly the good life? Does that truly make for a happy life? We might, honor is not used as much today as maybe we would say fame. Fame, okay. Fame is not the same as honor. It's similar, okay. We could use some of the same arguments. We have to remember that Aristotle is writing in an era where the concept of honor is probably a good bit more noble than our understanding of simple fame. When we think about, look at our superhero movies. Like Captain America, for example, usually acts honorably. He does not ever want to violate certain ethical principles. He wants to maintain maintain his dignity as man. And he doesn't want innocent lives to be violated or hurt in any way, shape, or form. The sense of honor. But honor, for Aristotle, definitely still does mean you're well known, you're well regarded, you're thought of as excellent in your field. When your name is spoken of, it's often spoken of. First of all, you're not ignored, okay, and it's spoken of well. So the tricky thing about honor is he says honor is kind of one of the is a temptation, I guess we would say, even of a very noble man or woman. That when we answer the question, what is truly a good life? That even noble, very intelligent people, they're gonna cross pleasure and wealth off the list pretty quickly, is what Aristotle would say. But they're gonna hesitate to cross honor off the list. Do you see what I mean by that? Well, we all want to, most of us, unless you're super introverted, which is possible, we want to be highly regarded. We want to be well known. We want to be well liked. And that is, that's very alluring to us. Like that's, even speaking about myself as a monk, would probably be the top on the list of temptations for me. The food that we have here is not very good. Like a lot of pleasures of the body, we don't really have much at a monastery. Wealth, I'm to understand that I get a paycheck for doing this. I've never seen it. Okay, so it's not the money, but do I want to be highly regarded? Would I like for these videos to become viral and everybody think that I'm the most brilliant person on the face of the planet? That sounds interesting, okay? So you see that is a tricky candidate, Aristotle will mention. But ultimately, the argument that he makes, and he goes through a few, but honor still does not come from within. Okay, think about this. If I think that a happy life is honor, that depends necessarily on your opinion of me. And what if I lose it? What if I lose that? What if someone accuses me of something? What if I fall out of grace? There are a number of different things that could happen where I would lose that honor. And this happens all the time in our culture, doesn't it? That, today, this singer or actor or whoever it is just amazing. And the next day, we can't stand them because we found out they did something terrible or they said something that we don't like or we just forget about it. So that honor is not self-sufficient. It's easily lost. And if I base my happipiness on what your opinion is of me, guess what? I'm going to live a sad life is what's going to happen. Okay. There's another possibility, and I'll state this as basically and strongly as I can, because sometimes it's kind of fun. You can be famous for the wrong reasons. In other words, Aristotle wants to say, look, just because you are honored does not mean that you are good. Aren't some people famous for being wicked and disgusting? I mean, some of the things that I see put on YouTube and, some of the things that people end up supporting or believing in can be rather shocking to us, right? And so it is absolutely not the case that being honorable equals being good, right? They can very much be separated in Aristotle's mind. So we have to cross that off the list. We have to cross it off the list, right? Okay. Now, hopefully, and you may disagree, again, with some of these assumptions, but I'm trying to show you Aristotle's line of thinking is, so in very broad strokes, okay, that the good of happiness, or that must be self-sufficient. And you can read a little bit more about that. He covers this in chapter 7, starting with, it's page 14 again. But what I want to get at, because I want to try to keep this within some bounds, to end with, at least right now, is happiness as being final, okay, is also a very, very important concept. Really, it's a fairly simple concept, but final and self-sufficient, particularly final, can mean this. I could say, okay, why did you come to college? And you could say a number. I want to be smarter. I want to get the degree. I want to be successful, etc. You can give me a number of answers that are very common. Right? And then I could, let's say, just successful. That would probably be one of the ones at the top of the list. Well, why do you want to be successful? Well, I want to make more money. I want to, I just want to succeed in this life. Well, why does that matter? And if I keep, you almost sound like a 3-year-old. Why is it that way? Why? It's a very important time in our lives. Those questions of why. My mother said that I was the why kid. Is it shocking that I ended up becoming a philosophy professor? Okay. What Aristotle is going to ultimately assert, which you may agree with or not, is that we end up arriving at the answer with the question why. Well, because it makes me happy. Think about it this way. When we ask the question, why do you want to be happy? Aristotle says there's nothing beyond that. That it is final and self-sufficient. It exists for its own sake. It does not exist for the sake of another. It is simply itself. In other words, if we're jumping from like these why questions, well, I want to be successful so I can meet somebody, and so I can do this, and so I can do that. And it's like this little trapeze artist kind of movement. Finally, when we get to the answer, well, I could just want to be happy, man. That it ends there. That our nature somehow comes to a certain rest. That's a very important concept to Aristotle. That by nature, we are a creature, we're in constant motion. We're constantly striving towards that telos, towards a goal, okay? Constantly. The whole universe is that way. But what Aristotle is going to say is ultimately contemplation, or even if you're in the Christian tradition, what was a contemplative experience or a spiritual experience, means that you have all this striving and you finally come and rest in the goal. That there's nowhere else to go. If you're Christian or even Islam, Buddha to a certain extent. If you discover the one, if you're resting in God himself, whom there's nothing beyond in those traditions, there's no more movement. You stop, you rest. You made it, man. You're done. Okay. But on a level of pleasure, just think about when we experience a certain pleasure. If you're even with someone that you say you love very, very much, you want that moment to never end. You want to freeze that moment. If you're looking at a beautiful sunset, you stop. You're completely present. There is nothing beyond that moment, and you want it to continue. You've reached final self-sufficiency. You're there. You're at the goal. In the moral life, it's similar to how Aristotle, or I think that the knowledge of that helps us to understand what Aristotle means by the fact that happiness is final and self-sufficient. And what he means by happiness is complex. And please understand that you could write, and there are many books defining what happiness is. You could fill a library with books written on that subject, and you could whole shelves of books on defining what that means. Okay, but for Aristotle, it's that certain sense of contentment, of rest of someone who's living a life well lived. Rational activity in accordance with virtue. Think about this for a moment. Who do you think, and this is why it's very, very important to differentiate the good life from a life of pleasure. I've had my own parishes. I've been a priest for almost 20 years. Say you have a mother who has a number of children. She wakes up early. She takes care of them. She's constantly working. She's a taxi cab driver. She's a cook. She's an arbiter of disputes. She's got a list of roles, a mile long, okay? She finally crawls in bed after she takes care of a sick kid at somewhere around midnight, sometimes if she's lucky, okay? And she brushes her teeth, hopefully, before she goes to sleep. Maybe her husband would probably appreciate it. And she looks at herself, and she worked her tail off that day. And she didn't experience a lot of pleasures. She really kind of worked all day. But she looks at the mirror and she smiles. And she's like, you know what? I was a real woman today. I was a good person today. And there's something in my heart that can rest in that final self-sufficient. That it hurt. Yeah, it hurt. But I lived my function well, rationally, Aristotle would say, in accordance with virtue. And she goes to sleep content. Okay, content is possibly a better word than just happiness. Sometimes there's problems with translation here. Because sometimes when we, in our culture, we're of course speaking English, when we say happy, we can mean lots of things. Very often, what we mean is that that's something emotional, purely emotional. I feel happy. Aristotle no, happiness is much deeper for Aristotle. It's just something that you must understand when we use the word happiness. Because she may have that mother that I just spoke about may have gone through a whole gamut of emotions. She may even be rather sad about a number of things. But there's some kind of deep abiding contentment there. The word that Aristotle's going to use most is eudaimonia. Okay, it literally means, remember I spoke about Socrates' daimon? Eudaimonia. Do you see the word? Daimon. It literally means good spirit. That's their word for happy. It's kind of interesting, isn't it? But it's more of a deeper, abiding sense of contentment in a life well lived in accordance with virtue. Now, Makarios, and Aristotle does recognize that this is possible. And it's a thorny point. He recognizes that it's a thorny point. Say we still take that woman, that she's doing what most of us would say, she's living a great life. She's doing what she's supposed to be doing. But she still experiences tragedy after tragedy after tragedy. There is an element of chance involved with experiencing true eudaimonia. That's what he means by saying that we call that person happy who truly lives a life in accordance with virtue in a complete life. That she didn't experience the fact that all of her children were killed in a car accident, God forbid, or that Aristotle recognizes that horrific tragedies can befall human persons that make this much harder to achieve. Not impossible. Not impossible, because remember, still, to truly experience happiness, that is something generated from within. And Aristotle, of course, did not have the same religious assumptions that some of us do, talking about things like grace or just miracles or gifts from God. That would be theology, right? We're not doing theology, we're doing philosophy here. But with that being said, there's another word for happiness, makarios. Eudaimonia can be defined more as the kind of happiness attainable by human effort. Makarios could be defined as that kind of happiness, then this is what Aristotle would say, which is more a gift of the gods. Okay, so he does make a kind of account for that if you do have a religious tradition. He does have an account, or in other words, the blessings of heaven can play a part in whether or not we truly experience our end, our proper goal. Okay, and if I'm not mistaken, and I'm almost positive I'm right, if you look at the Beatitudes with Jesus, right, many of this is a Catholic college, so it's appropriate to at least mention a little bit of this, although not make it our subject, because again, it's philosophy. The word that Jesus uses for blessed are those who are poor in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn. You remember that list of things? That list is mentioned in two different Gospels. Matthew and I think it's Luke. I can't remember. Makarios is the word used. Makarios. That's interesting, isn't it? Jesus does not use eudaimonia. Now, the word most often used for happiness in this book, Aristotle, is going to be eudaimonia. He's concerned with what is possible by human effort. And he's like, look, we don't need to talk about this. That's up to the gods, and that's up to your relationship with the gods, however you might define that. And so those are some of the basic assumptions of this chapter. If I think that I need to supplement it, and I'll look through the list and see if maybe I would like to add something, because this is a very important chapter, then I will do so. And I thank you very much for your attention. Bye-bye.